The rain fell in heavy sheets across Victoria Island, Lagos, turning the normally bustling streets into rivers of murky water. Most people had scattered for shelter, but not everyone had somewhere to go. Beneath the flickering streetlight outside the Silverbird Galleria, a small figure huddled against the wall, her thin frame barely visible through the downpour. Her name was Grace, though most people who passed her daily never bothered to ask. At 17, she looked younger, her slight build and worn clothes making her seem like a ghost haunting the wealthy neighborhood. In her hands, she clutched a battered acoustic guitar, its wood swollen from moisture, strings rusty but still somehow holding their tune. Grace began to sing. Her voice cut through the rain like a knife through silk, pure, haunting, and impossibly beautiful. It was the kind of voice that made people stop mid-stride, that made the chaos of Lagos fade into background noise. The song was an old Nigerian hymn her grandmother had taught her, but Grace sang it with such raw emotion that it felt brand new. Across the street, shielded beneath the awning of a luxury hotel, stood Marcus Okonkwo. At 42, Marcus was everything Grace was not. His custom-tailored suit probably cost more than most Lagosians made in a year. His shoes were Italian leather, pristine despite the rain. As the founder and CEO of Okonkwo Enterprises, one of West Africa's most successful tech conglomerates, Marcus had built an empire from nothing. He was worth billions, and everyone knew it. But money hadn't made Marcus happy. It had made him successful, powerful, feared even, but not happy. He was waiting for his driver when he heard it. That voice. Marcus prided himself on his immunity to sentiment, on his ability to remain unmoved by the sob stories that filled Lagos streets. He'd built his fortune on calculated decisions, not emotional ones. Yet something about this girl's voice made him pause. Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped out into the rain. Grace's eyes were closed as she sang, water streaming down her face, mixing with tears she didn't realize she was crying. She sang for her grandmother, gone 3 years now. She sang for her younger brother, David, lying in a hospital bed across town in Yaba. She sang because it was the only thing she knew how to do that made the world feel bearable. When she opened her eyes, a man stood before her. Marcus Okonkwo looked down at the girl, rain soaking through his expensive suit, and for the first time in years, he felt something crack inside his carefully constructed walls. Her voice had done what millions of naira in therapy could not, it had reached him. "How much do you make in a day?" Marcus asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Grace blinked up at him, startled. She was used to people throwing coins at her without making eye contact, not standing in the rain to talk to her. "Sir." Her voice was small, uncertain. "Singing here." "How much do you make?" Grace looked down at the small plastic container at her feet. On a good day, she might collect 2,000 or 3,000 naira. Today, in the rain, she had maybe 500. It varies, sir." Marcus pulled out his wallet and extracted several crisp 1,000 naira notes. He placed them in her container without counting. Grace's eyes widened, it was more money than she'd seen in months. "What's your name?" "Grace, sir." "Grace Adeyemi." "You have a remarkable voice, Grace." Marcus turned to leave, then paused. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" "My grandmother, sir. She was a church singer. She taught me everything before she." Grace's voice trailed off. Marcus nodded slowly. He should leave. His driver had just pulled up. He had a board meeting in the morning. But something kept him rooted to the spot. "Why are you out here in the rain? Don't you have family?" Grace's expression shifted, and Marcus saw something flash across her face, pain, fear, determination all mixed together. "I have a brother, sir. He's sick. I'm trying to raise money for his treatment." And there it was. The sob story Marcus had been waiting for. He'd heard thousands of them over the years. Everyone in Lagos had a sick relative, a dying parent, a child who needed surgery. It was the oldest trick in the book. But something in Grace's eyes told him she wasn't lying. Marcus couldn't get Grace's voice out of his head. For 3 days, it haunted him, at board meetings, during conference calls with investors in Abuja, even in the quiet of his Ikoyi penthouse. He tried to dismiss it as a momentary lapse in judgment, a brief surrender to sentimentality. But on the 4th day, he found himself driving back to Victoria Island, to that same street corner. Grace was there, as if she'd never left. This time the weather was clear, and in the daylight, Marcus could see her more clearly. She was thinner than he'd realized, her clothes threadbare but clean. She sang with the same intensity, though her fingers trembled slightly on the guitar strings. This time, Marcus didn't approach her. Instead, he made a call. "James, I need you to look into someone for me." James Adekunle was Marcus's head of security, a former DSS officer who could find information on anyone in Nigeria. Within 24 hours, he had Grace's entire story. Grace Adeyemi, 17 years old, orphaned 3 years ago when her grandmother died of a stroke. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 8, leaving her and her younger brother, David, in their grandmother's care. When the grandmother passed, the children had no other family willing to take them in. Grace had dropped out of school in SS2 to support herself and David. She sang on the streets, did odd jobs, slept in a tiny room she rented in Ajegunle, one of Lagos's most notorious slums. She sent every kobo she could spare to cover David's care at a public hospital in Yaba. David, age 12, had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The report included medical records that James had somehow acquired. The boy needed chemotherapy, possibly a bone marrow transplant. The costs were staggering, far beyond what a street singer could ever hope to raise. The hospital was keeping David alive on basic care, but without proper treatment, the doctors gave him less than a year. Marcus sat in his office on the 35th floor of his building in Ikoyi, the Lagos skyline spread out before him, and read the report 3 times. He thought about his own childhood in a village outside Enugu. He thought about his mother, who died because they couldn't afford her medication. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself back then, that he would never be helpless again, that he would never watch someone he loved die because of money. He'd kept that promise. He'd built an empire. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten why. When Marcus approached Grace the next evening, she recognized him immediately. She straightened up, surprise and hope flickering across her face. "Mr. Okonkwo," she said, remembering his name from the business cards that occasionally fell from the wallets of wealthy passers-by. "Grace." Marcus studied her for a moment. "I want to make you an offer." Grace's heart began to race. She'd heard stories of wealthy men who made offers to young girls on the streets. She took an instinctive step back. Marcus saw her fear and raised his hands. "Not that kind of offer. I want to help you. Your brother, David, I know about his condition." Grace's face went pale. "How do you?" "I have resources," Marcus said simply. "I can help him. I can get him the treatment he needs. The best doctors, the best facility. I can give him a fighting chance." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes. "Sir, I can't pay you back. I don't have. I'm not asking you to pay me back." Grace stared at him, uncomprehending. In Lagos, nobody did something for nothing. There was always a catch, always an angle. "Why?" she whispered. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Because I can," he finally said. "And because your voice reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that, sir?" "That there's still beauty in this world worth protecting." The next week moved like a dream Grace was afraid to wake up from. Marcus's people came. Efficient, professional, impossibly kind. They moved David from the overcrowded public hospital in Yaba to a private facility in Victoria Island, one of the best in West Africa. The doctors there had trained in London, New York, and Johannesburg. They took one look at David's file and immediately began an aggressive treatment plan. Grace was set up in a small but comfortable apartment near the hospital so she could be close to her brother. Marcus arranged for her to continue her education, hiring tutors to help her catch up on the years she'd missed. But he didn't stop there. Marcus had spent his entire adult life building walls around his heart. He'd learned early that showing weakness in business was fatal, that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd had relationships, even been married once, but he'd never let anyone truly in. Grace was different. Not because he saw her romantically, she was a child, and he had no such inclinations. But her voice, her determination, the way she'd sacrificed everything for her brother, it awakened something in Marcus he thought had died with his mother. He started visiting the hospital. At first, he told himself it was just to check on his investment, to make sure David was receiving proper care. But soon he found himself staying longer, talking to Grace about music, about life, about her dreams. Grace wanted to be a singer, a real one. She wanted to record albums, perform on stages, make her grandmother proud. But more than that, she wanted David to be okay. She wanted them to have a real home, a real family. "What about you?" Grace asked Marcus one evening as they sat in the hospital cafeteria. David was sleeping upstairs, recovering from his latest round of chemotherapy. "Do you have family?" Marcus's expression hardened. "No. Not anymore. I'm sorry." "Don't be. I have everything I need." Grace looked at him with those knowing eyes that seemed far too old for her 17 years. "Do you, though?" The question rattled Marcus more than he cared to admit. 3 months into treatment, David was showing remarkable improvement. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Grace was thriving in her studies, and Marcus had even arranged for her to work with a vocal coach, a woman named Patricia who trained some of Nigeria's biggest music stars. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Then came the day that changed everything. Marcus was in Port Harcourt for business when he got the call from James, his security chief. There was something in James's voice that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Sir, we need to talk about Grace." "What about her?" "There's something in her medical file. Something I think you should know." Marcus caught the next flight back to Lagos. By evening, he was sitting in his office, staring at a medical report that turned his world upside down. Grace was sick. Very sick. The same disease that was killing her brother was also inside her. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. But while David's case had been caught early, Grace's had been progressing silently for over 2 years. She'd been so focused on saving David that she'd ignored her own symptoms, the fatigue, the bruising, the weight loss. By the time the routine blood work Marcus had insisted on was processed, Grace's cancer had advanced to stage 3. The doctors were blunt: without immediate aggressive treatment, Grace had perhaps 6 months to live. Maybe less. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He thought about every conversation he'd had with Grace, looking for signs he'd missed. The way she was always tired. The way she wore long sleeves even in Lagos's heat to hide the bruises on her arms. The way she sometimes had to sit down suddenly, overwhelmed by dizziness she attributed to not eating enough. She'd known. God help him, she'd known and hadn't said anything. Marcus found Grace in the hospital courtyard, sitting on a bench and strumming her guitar softly. David was inside, finally strong enough to walk the halls on his own. The treatment was working for him. He was going to be okay. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus's voice cut through the evening air. Grace's fingers stilled on the strings. She didn't turn around. "Tell you what? Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Grace set the guitar aside carefully and finally looked at him. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Because David needed to get better first. Grace. You don't understand, Mr. Okonkwo. David is 12. He has his whole life ahead of him. I'm 17. I've already lived more than I thought I would. Marcus wanted to shake her. That's insane. You're a child. You have decades ahead of you, a career, a life. I have a brother who needs me healthy enough to take care of him. Grace stood up, and despite her small frame, there was a fierceness to her that made Marcus step back. The money you were spending on me, every naira, that was money that could go to David's treatment. I couldn't ask you to save us both. You didn't have to ask. Grace, I have enough money to save you both 1,000 times over. I know that now. Grace's voice broke. But when you first offered to help, I didn't know you. I didn't know if your generosity would stretch to 2 sick kids instead of 1. And I couldn't risk David's life on a maybe. Marcus sank onto the bench, his anger deflating into something that felt like grief. So you were just going to die? Quietly, without telling anyone? Let yourself waste away after David got better? Grace sat back down beside him. I was going to sing as long as I could. Make sure David was okay. And then, yes. They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of Lagos traffic filtering through the hospital walls. You're an idiot, Marcus finally said, but his voice was gentle. Grace laughed, a wet, broken sound. I know. And you're also the bravest person I've ever met. I'm not brave. I'm just a sister doing what sisters do. Marcus turned to look at her, this small, fierce girl who'd been willing to die for her brother, who'd sung in the rain to make a few naira, who'd somehow cracked open his heart and made him care again. Well, now you're going to do what people who have billionaires in their corner do, Marcus said firmly. You're going to fight. You're going to let me help you. And you're going to live. Mr. Okonkwo. Marcus. Call me Marcus. And this isn't a request, Grace. I've already spoken to the doctors. We're starting your treatment tomorrow. The best oncologists, the best facility. If you need a transplant, we'll find a donor. If you need experimental treatment, we'll fly you wherever you need to go. You're not dying. I won't allow it. Grace wiped her eyes. Why do you care so much? Marcus was quiet for a long time before he answered. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he'd kept bottled up for decades. My mother died when I was 15. Cancer, just like you and David. We lived in a village outside Enugu. We had nothing. I watched her waste away because we couldn't afford treatment, couldn't get her to a proper hospital. She died in agony, and I was helpless. He paused, the memories clearly painful. I swore then that I would never be helpless again. That I would make enough money that I could save anyone I cared about. But I spent so many years building that fortune that I forgot why I was building it. I forgot what it was for. Marcus looked at Grace. And then I heard you sing in the rain, and I remembered. You reminded me. You and David, you're giving me a chance to keep the promise I made to my mother all those years ago. You're letting me be the person I always wanted to be. Grace reached out and took his hand. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Marcus said. Thank me when you're healthy and performing in front of thousands. Thank me when David graduates from university. Thank me when you're both old and gray and annoying your own children. Despite everything, Grace smiled. Deal. The next 6 months were the hardest of Grace's life, and she'd already lived through some pretty hard times. The chemotherapy was brutal. She lost her hair, her appetite, her energy. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed, when every bone in her body ached, when she wondered if Marcus's faith in her was misplaced. But David was there, finally healthy and strong. He sat by her bedside and told her stories, made her laugh, reminded her why she was fighting. And Marcus was there too, more than Grace had expected. He reorganized his entire life around her treatment schedule. He missed board meetings to sit with her during chemotherapy. He flew in specialists from Abuja, from South Africa, from America. He spent money like water, and for the first time in his life, it felt like his wealth was worth something. The doctors eventually found a match for a bone marrow transplant, a young woman from Calabar whose donation would give Grace the best chance at survival. The surgery was scheduled at a cutting-edge facility Marcus had essentially bought out for the day. The night before the procedure, Grace asked Marcus to bring her guitar to her hospital room in Victoria Island. "I want to sing something," she said. "In case." "Don't," Marcus said sharply. "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. I know. But just in case, I want you to hear this." Grace's voice was weaker than it had been that rainy night when they'd first met, but it still carried that same haunting beauty. She sang the same hymn, the one her grandmother had taught her, but this time she sang it as a prayer of gratitude. When she finished, there were tears streaming down Marcus's face. He wasn't ashamed. For the first time since his mother's death, he let himself feel everything, the pain, the fear, the hope, the love. "You're going to make it," he said fiercely. "You're going to sing that song at your first concert, and everyone in Lagos is going to know your name." Grace smiled weakly. "From your mouth to God's ears." The surgery was a success. The recovery was long and painful, but Grace was young and strong and stubborn. 3 months later, she was declared in remission. 6 months after that, the doctors said the word she'd been praying for, cured. David was already back in school, catching up on the years he'd lost to illness. Marcus had enrolled him in one of Lagos's best private schools and hired tutors to help him adjust. The boy was thriving, and seeing him healthy and happy made every painful moment worth it. As for Grace, Marcus kept his promise. He connected her with Patricia, the vocal coach, and with producers, managers, and industry professionals. He used his connections to open doors that would have been closed to a street singer from Ajagunle. But Grace earned every opportunity on her own merit. Her voice, her presence, her story, she was undeniable. A year and a half after that rainy night when Marcus first heard her sing, Grace Adeyemi performed her first real concert at Eco Hotel in Victoria Island. The venue was packed with over 2,000 people. News outlets from across Nigeria had covered her story, the street singer who'd been saved by a billionaire, who'd fought cancer and won, who was now poised to become one of the country's biggest stars. But as Grace stood backstage, waiting for her cue, she wasn't thinking about fame or success. She was thinking about her grandmother, hoping she'd be proud. She was thinking about David, sitting in the front row with the biggest smile on his face. And she was thinking about Marcus, who changed her life for no other reason than that he'd heard her sing in the rain and decided to care. Marcus stood in the wings, watching as Grace walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. She looked healthy, vibrant, alive in a way that seemed impossible given where she'd been 2 years ago. As the music started and Grace began to sing, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in over 2 decades, peace. He'd spent his life chasing success, building empires, proving to the world and himself that he was powerful enough to never be helpless again. But he'd learned something from a 17-year-old girl with a beat-up guitar and more courage than anyone he'd ever known. True power wasn't about money or influence. It was about choosing to care when you didn't have to. It was about using what you had to make someone else's life better. It was about letting people in, even when it scared you, even when it hurt. Grace's voice soared through the venue, and for the second time in his life, Marcus Okonkwo felt tears streaming down his face. But this time, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of joy.